You got my email, right?
I did.
I couldn't open Microsoft Word because the Windows 11 update, I had antivirus software downloaded on my computer, and the Windows 11 update screwed with it, so I can't search anything. I don't have Microsoft Word on my home page, so I couldn't open it because the search engine was off. So I did it on Google Drive, but I can figure out how to put the Google Drive document onto the
Yeah, I don't know.
You can just download the file as a doc.
I did, and I couldn't open the file explorer either.
You can make it, I mean, if you do it as a PDF, then you can attach it, but there's sometimes problems, so. But I got it, and they're all good.
Most of my thing was just comparing it to the Eternals.
Hey, Avery,
Hey,
how are you this morning?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. When are they gonna let you come back?
Sunday is my 10th day, so I'll be cleared on Monday.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I bet you're happy about that, aren't you?
Yeah. I'm ready to come back.
Well, has your ankle had some time to heal at least?
Yeah, that was one good thing about it. I got to do a lot of just rehab and then a lot of rest. So I should be back to everything normal on Monday. So Mhm.
All right. So we're gonna finish up Hinduism today, and Avery, you can see this, but they can't because I don't have the laptop turned around, but you can see there's a Buddha on top. So we're gonna start Buddhism on Monday. So and today, so don't forget, if you haven't uploaded or turned in your reflection yet, that's due today. So just be sure you get that uploaded to Canvas, or if you have a problem, you can send it to me as an email attachment. Anyways, we're going to look a little bit more about the caste system, but more just sort of how it's operating in the modern world. And then mostly we're going to look at sort of Hinduism and the sort of political evolution that's taken place in Hinduism, because it's important for how Hinduism is sort of being expressed in India in particular, but then also how it's interacting with the rest of the world. But we're going to start this morning with a little bit of backward looking about a concept. We didn't talk about this, but this is a really important concept in Hinduism. And part of the reason we didn't talk about it is because I wanted to wait till today, because it connects directly to people like Gandhi, and then obviously in the United States to persons like Martin Luther King Jr. So, and this concept is the principle of Ahimsa, and that's spelled Ahimsa. And where I'm going to sort of describe what Ahimsa is to you. Yep. Ahimsa. So Ahimsa. It's one of the few words in Hinduism that in Sanskrit that actually translates pretty easily to English. This pertains both to karma and dharma. And our discussion on Monday about sort of Arjuna's reluctance to kill his kinsmen is also tied up in this idea. And Ahimsa means non-violence. That's the sort of translation of it into English as non-violence. And it's an ancient concept in Hinduism that emerged sort of as an ethical concept in the Mahabharata. So that long epic that we talked about, which the Bhagavad Gita is part of, Ahimsa emerged in there as an ethical concept of nonviolence. So it was present in Hinduism before, but it began to become really a force. And how it developed in that epic was that nonviolence generated positive karma, okay? Now, we all know that ultimately, you know, in order to get liberation, you need to not have any karma, right? Positive or negative. But because this notion of ahimsa being generating positive karma, it was seen as a good thing, okay? And you'll see how this plays out and how it sort of creates sort of a new dimension in Hinduism around this ethics. So Ahimsa sees that all karmic activity is interconnected, okay? So every action that you and I engaged in not only has a consequence for our own life, it has a consequence for all other living beings, both animal and plant, okay? Although for many Hindus and other religious traditions, it's mostly focused on animals, but anyway. And so any art action that harms another being is said to affect all beings. So if I harm a worm, that has a harm to all living beings, okay? And so, for example, if I kill an animal, it has a karmic effect on me, it has a karmic effect on that animal, but collectively, it has an effect on all beings, okay? This is why many Hindus adopted a practice of being vegetarians. Now, not all Hindus are vegetarians, but this is why Hinduism and vegetarianism developed, because of this notion of ahimsa. For some, though, ahimsa takes a very extreme sort of position. And this is, we're going to talk about this extreme position for a minute, because this led to some new schools in Hinduism and then eventually a new religious tradition, okay? And so this extreme position in ahimsa leads to sort of an extreme asceticism. And do you know what an ascetic is? Does anybody know what an ascetic is? An ascetic, if you think of a monk that's sitting out in the desert somewhere in the wilderness, praying all the time and not engaging in any activity that could be perceived as harming or violent or somehow disrupting the rest of the world. That's sort of extreme asceticism. And what this sort of devolves into is basically non-action, okay? And the reason being is this belief is that any kind of action that you engage in ultimately can harm something. And how that would develop. Now, right now, this is it's sort of a strange reality, but anyway, in the past, before most of the globe were wearing masks, sometimes you would see Indian people wearing a face mask. And I'm not talking like you see in China and stuff because of pollution. You would see Indian persons wearing a face mask. The reason they were wearing a face mask was they didn't want to accidentally breathe in a fly or some kind of living organism. And so the mask would prevent you from breathing in some living organism. And obviously, if you accidentally swallow a fly, what happens to the fly? It dies, right? the belief became that that accidental activity caused harm. This also led to the notion that you'll see this, and this is how the sort of schools developed around Ahimsa, and then a new religion developed. This is, or practices. You'll see sometimes in India or Indian people in other countries carrying a broom in front of them, or like almost like a Swiffer duster in front of them, and they're dusting everything as they walk. The reason they're doing that is they don't want any living organisms on the ground in front of them, so they don't want to accidentally step on a worm or an ant. And so you'll see the person brushing right in front of them, then they'll take a step and brush again, and take a step and brush again, with the notion that they're dispersing the living organism and not harming it, okay?
Seems extremely.
What's that?
It seems extremely time-consuming.
Of course it is. Well, this is also why this notion of extreme asceticism developed, because if you just go off in the desert and you pray all the time and don't engage in any activity, you're less likely to harm anybody, and you don't have to take all this time to do these kind of things, okay? So what happened as Ahimsa became more prominent in Hinduism, there became a discussion about whether intentional, or whether there was a difference between an intentional or volitional and non-intentional or non-volitional harming of an animal in particular, or a being. And so they began to discuss at a deep level whether you had a karmic positive or negative gaining in how you harm something. So if you accidentally breathed something in and it died, did you get negative karma from that, okay? Well,
It's too much.
right, or stepped on, or other kind of things. Anyway, this discussion became so important to people that, have you ever heard of Jainism or Jains?
Yes.
Okay, well, Jains or Jains, depending on how you say it, that became an offshoot of Hinduism, really around this question of Ahimsa, okay? And whether you, and how you injured something. Now, for some people, it also included plants, okay? So Jains are all vegetarians, okay? But some persons that have adopted a practice of Ahimsa say that even certain plants can feel pain or be harmed. Now that's a very extreme position, but all Jains are by virtue of their religious tradition, because of this practice of Ahimsa, vegetarians. Many Hindus are also vegetarians because of this, but not all of them.
What, like, say, like, a Hindu is like a big cricket player, because the cricket is big in India.
Yes.
What if they like accidentally like hurt somebody playing cricket? Like,
Well, and this would be, and that's a great question. So then this sort of philosophical question that developed of whether it was an accident or intentional. In some Hindus will say that Ahimsa only applies to intentional harm, okay? So the nonviolence and the negative karma that you gain only applies to intentional action. Other Hindus will say, and Jains will say, that it's both intentional or unintentional. So that would really depend on what level you analyze that, okay? The vast majority of Hindus that practice Ahimsa and see it as an ethical model go in the realm of intentional harm, okay? So they would say if you accidentally harm something or someone, you're not going to get bad karma from it, okay? That's why you don't see every Hindu person wearing a face mask or carrying a broom in front of themselves or whatever. Now, I'm sure every one of you in this room has heard of this person. Gandhi?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good. Do you know who Gandhi was, aside from a famous Indian person?
He led the revolution against Great Britain to try to get peace for India.
Correct. Well, for independence. So great, great. And he was born in India. He was a lawyer. Your textbook mentions him very briefly, along with some other people. We're going to talk a little bit more about Gandhi, because Gandhi's leading ethical principle was Ahimsa. Okay. And he was born in 1869 and died in 1948. He was assassinated. So shortly after India gained independence, he was assassinated by radical Hindus. So Gandhi himself was a Hindu, but there was radical Hindus that assassinated him. And this will become important in a few minutes, but we'll leave this aside for the moment and talk about Gandhi and how Ahimsa became his ethical guiding principle. So he's a faithful Hindu, okay? He's born in India under British colonial rule. He becomes a lawyer. If you don't know this, he goes to South Africa in the early 1900s and is part of the Indian community in South Africa and works at that time on policies and stuff to change racial discrimination in South Africa. Because remember the apartheid system in South Africa being white people, then Indian people, then people of color, then blacks, you know. And so each of the, it wasn't a caste system in the way we had in India, but it was a caste system based on race and skin tone in South Africa. And so Gandhi's experience in South Africa and his work as a lawyer in South Africa to try to change some of the racial policies led him to eventually go back to India and work to overthrow British colonial rule. And his guiding principle of Ahimsa led him to engage in nonviolent revolution or nonviolent political activity. And so Gandhi believed at the core of his being that the only way you could achieve successful independence and defeat the British was not by engaging in nonviolent action. Because there were already people fighting the British government, okay? There were already there were already Indians fighting the British government with guns. But imagine in the early 1900s going into the 1940s, so India gets its independence in 1947. But that time, Great Britain is one of the most powerful nations on the planet, okay? And like many powerful nations, they have lots of weapons, and the people fighting against them have very few weapons and very few options, okay? And so Gandhi adopted the practice of nonviolent engagement. Not surprising, at the same time, who is becoming important and what's becoming important in the United States? The American Civil Rights Movement, right? For Black freedom, and particularly after World War II and into the 1950s. And who becomes the most prominent figure in the American Civil Rights Movement? Martin Luther King Jr., who adopted Gandhi's practice of nonviolence. So a Hindu lawyer gave Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Christian minister, the conceptual framework to have a nonviolent political revolution for civil rights. Now, obviously, Martin Luther King owes much to Gandhi, but he also saw in the Christian scriptures and in Jesus' behavior also, notions like someone, hits you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. So even Martin Luther King saw in the Christian scriptures and the Old Testament a notion of nonviolence. But it was Gandhi's sort of merging of nonviolence with political action that King had never thought about, really. And so I want to lift that up because that becomes both central to the way the Indians defeat the British and get freedom, independence, and it's obviously central to the American Civil Rights Movement, and it's connected to this notion of Ahimsa. All right. So after independence comes in 1947, a government's formed, and the first prime minister of India is Nehru. And we'll talk briefly about Nehru, but he's the first prime minister. Gandhi is still a leading political advocate, and he's going around the country speaking to different groups about the formation of the new country, the creation of a constitution and all this kind of stuff. And he's assassinated in 1948 by what then was called a sort of radical Hindu nationalist. Later on, that person is part of now the sort of political movement that is actually known as Hindu nationalism. And the reason this happens is, even though Gandhi is a faithful Hindu, and he personally practices Hinduism, the constitution in India is a secular constitution. The same as the American Constitution. In fact, the Indian Constitution in many ways is modeled after the American Constitution. And Gandhi, being a lawyer, one of the great strengths he saw about the American Constitution was freedom of religion. And that you couldn't, and that you shouldn't make a religion, a specific religion, a requirement to be a citizen or in some way connected to the Constitution, okay? And so this faithful Hindu who practiced Ahimsa to overcome and defeat the British makes it clear that the country should be a secular country, and that all people, regardless of their religious tradition and caste. So you'll see what happens in a moment. But those two things become the guiding principle for Nehru and for Gandhi. And because of Gandhi's advocacy of that, he's assassinated by someone who wants Hinduism to be more fully embedded into the Indian Constitution. The caste system is outlawed in 1950. So officially in 1950, it's illegal for people to be discriminated against based on their caste. So this is the first time in basically all of India's history that the Dalits, the untouchables, will have access to education and jobs and other kind of things like anybody else, okay? Now, I'm sure you've already thought about this and sort of thought about, look at what happened in America in the 60s when we passed the civil rights bills. Did that automatically mean that Black people were treated equally? Did it automatically mean they could go to any school they wanted to? Did it automatically mean they could get any job? You're all shaking your heads no. Because for hundreds of years prior to that, there had been systemic and legal discrimination, right? The same thing in India's case, it's thousands of years of systemic and legal discrimination and religious discrimination. So it's outlawed, and the good thing is that because it's outlawed, at least legally, the untouchables and people in the lower caste now by law have the ability to get jobs, go to school, and do things that are not connected to their caste, okay? What begins to happen, though, is in formal and informal ways, the caste system is reinstituted, okay? And your textbook touches on this a little bit, but it becomes more pronounced with the politicization of Hinduism, which we're going to talk about in a moment, and the modern economy. Now, for most people, you would think the modern economy is a great thing, because today in America and in other Western democracies, for the most part, if you get a good education and you have access to healthcare, and other kind of things, mostly you can apply for a job and get any kind of job you want, right? Regardless of the color of your skin, your gender, other kind of things. So for the most part, the modern economy is a democratizing kind of thing. And in India, early on, it was as well, because for the first time, the Dalits, the servant class, the Sudras, and other folks were able to begin to go and apply for regular jobs, to go to school, and these kind of things. And then engineering, computers, and these kind of things began to provide an opportunity for people that had never been able to have real employment to get that. And so things began to shift. But the modern economy and modern economics got subsumed into the politicization of Hinduism. And that was the rise of, or rejection of, the secular government. So remember, Gandhi in 48 is assassinated by what today someone might call as a right-wing Hindu. I'll try not to use that term because right and left wings in other countries isn't necessarily the same way it is in our country, but that would be the sort of vernacular framing of it, okay? We might also say a religious fanatic or something like that, but I don't want to, I want to shy away from using those words. But this person and the group that that person represented wanted Hinduism to be part of the constitution of the country, and wanted Hindu identity, which is somewhat separate from Hindu religion, to be one of the deciding characteristics of power in the country, okay? So what happens is this term Hindu nationalism. Many of you ever heard that term, Hindu nationalism? Yes. Okay. So remember, India is a country of about 1.2 billion people. About 1 billion of those people, or so, 900 million, 1 billion, somewhere in that area, are identified as Hindu, okay? So the vast majority of folks in India are Hindu. The second largest religious group are Muslims, okay? What begins to happen, and this happens very early, 1947, in the Articles of Independence, the northern region of India is separated and becomes known as Pakistan. Have you ever heard of the country of Pakistan? Well, Pakistan used to be part of what was known as British colonial India, okay? And Pakistan was part of that country. Pakistan is partitioned off, and now you have early on what was called British India and Pakistan, and then you have this small region called the Kashmir, okay? And the Kashmir becomes a disputed territory. It becomes disputed because many of the people that live in Kashmir are Muslim, but it's governed by India and not Pakistan, okay? So since 1947, or very shortly thereafter, Pakistan and India have been battling over this, and there are soldiers placed on the in Kashmir and on the border, and there have been border skirmishes between India and Pakistan. Pakistan, as you know, is a predominantly Muslim country, and part of the reason it was partitioned off, I mean, there are many reasons, but was because of the fact that it was predominantly Muslim, okay? But Pakistan and India have now been engaged in this, 70-year battle, really, over the rule of Kashmir, and that led to a sense of unease among Hindu folks. And then the rise of one political party and one volunteer organization, if you will. There are some other political parties, but we're going to talk about these two in particular, because now these two groups shape what is known as Hindu nationalism. And the first is the political party BJP. And the BJP party is, and what that is in English is Indian People's Party, okay? And BJP is the most powerful party in India. The current Prime Minister, Modi, M-O-D-I, is a member of the BJP. And Modi is a Hindu nationalist. He's also a member of RSS, and RSS is the National Self-Service Association. Now that sounds like a great thing, right? The National Self-Service Association. Well, in fact, what the National Self-Service Association is a Hindu nationalist paramilitary volunteer organization. So they promote Hindu nationalism through paramilitary or activity. So if you wanted to do an equivalent in America, that would be like the Aryan Brotherhood or something like that. And I'm not being extreme when I use that, because what's the Aryan Brotherhood's sole purpose? To make America a white Protestant Christian nation, right? The BJP, the political party, and the National Self-Service Association, their primary goals are through ideology and so forth to make India a Hindu nation. And they've gone to great lengths to do this. But what's happened since Modi's been the prime minister is that Hindu nationalism has grown in power, and therefore that has led to numerous attacks on Muslim persons individually. A number of mosques have been bombed and so forth. And therefore, what happens when you attack Muslim folks and you attack their religious centers? What are they likely to do? Retaliate. So there's been enormous, violence in northern regions of India, which are more Muslim dominated near the border and so forth. There has been lots of attacks on Hindus by Muslims there, and in regions that are more heavily Hindu populated, and at times other, like basically marauding bands of folks have gone and attacked Muslim persons. How this is played out is sort of interesting, and much of the language that's used by Hindu nationalists is connected to the idea, and this is a very important idea today in India, and that's Hinduva, and I'll spell this for you because it has a silent T. It's Hinduva, and Hinduva translates into Hindu-ness. Now, Hindu-ness is different than Hinduism. When I say Hindu-ness, what do you think Hindu-ness means?
How devoted you are?
No, because remember, this is a political ideology and not a religious ideology.
Yeah, it's like the idea, maybe how pure your Hinduism is.
Ding, 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 ding. And not just how pure your Hinduism, how pure you are because of that. So remember I said that the caste system is illegal, but it's informally and formally reared its ugly head, if you will. Hindu Va has given the gateway to the caste system to reemerge. Because what was the caste system all based on? Remember? The purity. And the most pure were the Brahmin, right? Then the nobles and the warriors, then the commoners, then the servants, and then the Dalits were not part of it. So Hindu Va has adopted the notion of the caste system and purity as a political ideology, not a religious concept. This will sort of be two more points and it'll be all for today. So Modi was elected prime minister in 2014. And he was already part of both the BJP, and the BJP is the strongest party in India, and it's been the ruling party for a while. But before Modi became prime minister, the BJP had been less focused on Hindu nationalism, okay? It's partially because of Modi's connection to that, the National Self-Service Association, that he's made this more important. And in a parliamentary system, how does do you know how a parliamentary system works?
The leader of the government is chosen through the parliament itself, to represent the majority party.
Right. So people don't elect Modi to be prime minister. They elect, they vote for his party. And if his party gets the most votes, then they're the ruling party. And then the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. And so the BJP is also the ruling party in government. So currently, if you did a sort of similar thing in our government, right now, the House of Representatives has slightly more Democrats in it than Republicans, right? And the Senate is split basically 50-50, right? In a parliamentary system, you might have 5 or 6 parties, not just 2, but 5 or 6. And the party that has the largest majority would become the ruling party. And then out of that, their prime minister. So in India, in 2014, when Modi was elected prime minister, people knew he was going to become prime minister if BJP got the most votes, okay? So they knew, because he was the leader of BJP, that he would become the prime minister, but they didn't necessarily vote for him. But BJP has become, in many parliamentary systems, you need a coalition to rule, okay? Because you don't have a simple majority. You might have 30% of the members of the parliament, but you don't have enough to vote. So then smaller groups you have to work with to come together. What's happening in India is BJP is the largest majority in the government, but some of the smaller coalitions that they work with are also Hindu nationalist groups, okay? So they had a general election again in 2019. So their general elections are every 5 years. They had another one in 2019, and the BJP again got the majority. So Modi was, again, re-elected as prime minister, if you will. But shortly after that, they passed an amendment to the Citizen Act, okay? Now, our Constitution has definitions of what a citizen is and how you become a citizen, okay? So if we wanted to change that, we would have to amend the Constitution to what defines a citizen, okay? The Indian Constitution has it as well. So in 2019, they passed an amendment to it. And the amendment was this. So the original Citizenship Act was 1955. And that provided a pathway to Indian citizenship for persecuted religious minorities, okay? And this is where it's important to understand this. So in 1955, the Indian Parliament, and remember in the 50s, they were secular, okay? They passed this, and The minorities were from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and who were Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsi, and Christians. If this is the change in the amendment. If they arrived in India before December of 2014, they had a pathway to citizenship, okay? The law does not grant such eligibility for Muslims from these countries. And so it was the first time that religion had been overtly used as a criteria for Indian citizenship.
So does not grant citizenship to Muslims from what country?
From Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, which are all predominant Muslim countries, okay? So prior to that, the original Citizenship Act didn't have a religious component to it, okay? When they changed this law, amended the act in 2019, they said that Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, etc., coming from these countries would have a pathway to citizenship if they had arrived in India before 2014. And notice, what year did Modi get elected prime minister? 2014. So, and they excluded Muslims. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is the other part of the Hindu-ness that they're promoting. And after 2014, those other minorities would not have a pathway either, okay? So, but Muslims were intentionally excluded because of the conflict between Islam and Hinduism, or in Pakistan and India more specifically. But what's happening in India now is similar to what's happening in other countries. Hindu nationalism, in this notion of Hindu-ness, which is separate from Hinduism, is defining not just sort of how people can operate in the country, but actual identities of who can be citizens and who has rights or not. And so this is an important evolution and something to watch. The final thing for today is about the role of women. And the one good thing, even though the caste system and there are still lots of gender issues in India, the role of women has drastically changed in India. And for the most part, not completely and not everywhere, women have much more freedom now than they did in prior decades and generations. But also, they're not locked into basically, only being able to function through marriage, okay? And so one benefit that's happened with the economy and education is that women have been able to move up in society. And interestingly enough, there have been women prime ministers in India, and we, again, have never had a female president in America. So even though you have this strange sort of the caste system and patriarchy and all these other things that dictated women's roles for millennia, really, they still have had women prime ministers in India and may yet again. But, so even though things aren't so great necessarily in terms of the reemergence of the caste system, the role of women have at least been ameliorated in society. Questions about Hinduism and what we've discussed so far?
We have a test over just Hinduism, or is it until
The test, the midterm, and it will just cover Hinduism and Buddhism. And so, and then, and once you have that test, then we'll start, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, And the test, the final will be over those religions, so it won't be,
So it's like.
it will not be cumulative.
Can you explain a little bit about what you're looking for in the reflection?
Yeah, so you read those 4 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, and if you read more, that's okay. All you need to include in the reflection is you can talk about what we discussed on Monday in class, in this sort of group discussion. But the reflection is really about your response to what you read. So the insights you saw, remember Avery on Monday made the comparison. She saw a connection between Arjuna's responsibility and Abraham and the Isaac story. If you notice something like that, anything, and really a page, if it's a little more than a page, it's okay. But I'm not expecting you to do research or give me broad definitions about the Bhagavad Gita or that. I really want you to write about what you took out of it, okay, or took away from it. And you might write, and very honestly, I didn't understand much of it, or it was really frustrating. And here are the reasons why it was frustrating, or here's why I didn't understand much. But the one thing I did get was this, or I found it really refreshing, and it gave me a lot of insight to Hinduism aside from what we've talked about in class. So it's that's why I call it a reflection, because you're really thinking about it and writing about what it meant to you. And after this one, I'll give you feedback and I'll write some notes. As you've had me before, you'll note that sometimes you can't read my handwriting. I'll try best to make it legible. But you'll see my responses if you're totally off track or not. But generally, it's not too hard to, write that. All right, thank you all. Everyone have a great weekend.